Officer Linda Carson always believed she was in control. She knew the rules, followed procedures, and did her job the way she was trained. She wasn't reckless. She wasn't careless. But one night, one decision changed everything. It had been a quiet shift so far, the kind Linda preferred. The streets were nearly empty, the soft hum of streetlights buzzing in the cool night air. Most of the traffic had died down, leaving the city in a still, peaceful silence. But then she saw it. A sleek black sedan rolled through an intersection up ahead. The car was polished, expensive, the kind you'd expect to see in a CEO's driveway. Nothing seemed off, except for one thing: no turn signal, a small violation. Minor, barely worth a stop. But rules were rules. Linda's fingers drummed against the steering wheel as she made a decision. Maybe the driver needed a reminder. Maybe she just wanted to break the boredom of the night. Either way, she flicked on her lights and pulled onto the street. The sedan's brake lights flared as it slowed down, then smoothly pulled over to the curb. At least that's what Linda thought. But in the next few minutes, her entire world was about to change. Linda turned on her sirens, the flashing red and blue lights cutting through the dark street. The black sedan reacted instantly, slowing down before pulling over to the curb with effortless control. No hesitation, no sudden movements. Linda parked behind it and exhaled. Routine stop, nothing unusual. But as she watched the car sit there perfectly still, something about it felt off. She grabbed her flashlight, adjusted her belt, and stepped out of the cruiser. The street was quiet except for the faint hum of distant traffic. The air was cool, but Linda felt a strange warmth rising in her chest, a slight unease she couldn't explain. As she approached the driver's side window, it rolled down slowly, almost deliberately, and there he was, a black man, mid-40s, neatly trimmed beard, dressed in a tailored navy blue suit that probably cost more than her monthly salary. His hands rested calmly on the steering wheel, his posture relaxed, not nervous, not impatient. Linda cleared her throat. "License and registration, please." The man's eyes met hers, steady, measuring. "May I ask why I'm being stopped, officer?" His voice was smooth, even, not defensive, not aggressive, just steady. Linda pressed her lips together. She didn't like that. Most people stammered a little, apologized, explained themselves. He didn't. "Failed to signal a turn back there," she said. A beat of silence. The man blinked once. "Did I?" His tone wasn't rude. It wasn't disrespectful. But something about the way he said it, a quiet, knowing challenge, made something tighten in Linda's chest. Her grip on her flashlight firmed. "License and registration," she repeated, sharper this time. The man didn't argue. He didn't sigh or roll his eyes. He just moved, controlled, as if he already knew what she was thinking. His right hand left the wheel, deliberate, measured, before reaching toward the glove compartment. His left hand remained in view. Linda felt her shoulders tense. The glove box clicked open. A leather wallet, a slim registration slip. Every movement was careful, practiced. He handed them to her without a word. Linda barely glanced at the ID before flicking her eyes back to him. His expression hadn't changed. Still calm, too calm. "Do you live around here?" she asked, her voice flat. The man exhaled through his nose, not quite a sigh, but something close. "I don't see how that's relevant." Linda's jaw tightened. She had been on the force for over a decade. She knew when someone wasn't taking her seriously, when someone thought they were above this. She straightened, gripping his ID a little tighter. "Step out of the vehicle." For the first time, the man's expression changed. Not shock, not anger, just the smallest shift in his jaw, a tiny crease between his brows. "Why?" His voice was still even, but there was something new underneath it. Linda took a step back. Her tone was final. I asked you to step out. For a second he didn't move. Then he sighed, unbuckled his seatbelt, pushed the door open, and stood up. Linda hadn't expected him to be this tall or this broad, and yet still completely calm. The tension in the air was no longer subtle. It was thick, palpable, and it was about to break. The man followed her orders without hesitation. No fear, no excuses, no signs of weakness. That alone made Linda uneasy. Most people, especially at a traffic stop, showed something. A little tension, a nervous glance, a shaky voice. But this man? Nothing. Linda motioned toward the car, hands on the trunk. He exhaled slowly, controlled, deliberate, before turning and placing his palms flat against the cool metal. She felt it now, the shift. This was her moment. Her heartbeat picked up, but it wasn't from fear. It was control. She reached out, pressing a firm hand against his back, guiding him down just slightly, a reminder that she was in charge. And then something snapped. Before she even thought about it, before she even realized what she was doing, her palm struck his face. A sharp, stinging crack, the sound ripped through the empty street. The man's head jerked slightly to the side, and then he didn't move. No anger, no protest, just stillness. For a few seconds, the world seemed to freeze. Linda's own breath hitched, her pulse roaring in her ears. Then slowly he turned his head back to look at her. His face was unreadable. His jaw clenched just once before he took a slow, steady breath. Without breaking eye contact, he reached into his jacket pocket. Linda's stomach twisted. Her hand hovered over her holster, but all he pulled out was his ID. He held it up, fingers loose around the edges, and for the first time Linda saw the name printed on it, Nathaniel Grant. Her eyes flickered to the title below, Chief of Police, her boss. And just like that, everything changed. Linda's heart slammed against her ribs. Nathaniel Grant, Chief of Police. Her breath caught. Her fingers went numb. She had just hit her boss. The weight of it crashed down on her all at once. Her career, her reputation, her future. And yet, he didn't react. No anger, no shouting, no threats. He just stood there, holding up his ID, watching her. And somehow, that was worse than if he had yelled. Linda couldn't move, couldn't think. A voice cut through the suffocating silence. "Everything okay here, Officer Carson?" Her head snapped toward the sound. A patrol car had pulled up behind hers. Officer Reynolds, her partner. His brows were pulled together in confusion as he stepped closer. He had no idea what had just happened. Linda's mouth opened, but before she could speak, Grant's voice cut in. "We're fine." Reynolds glanced between them, uncertain, suspicious. "Sir, Grant didn't look at him, didn't break eye contact with Linda. Then in the calmest voice possible, he asked, "Am I free to go?" Linda's throat tightened. This was it, the moment. Say yes. Let him leave. Hope he didn't file a report or double down, try to take back control. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Grant let out a low chuckle, not amused, not mocking, just cold. "Officer Carson," he said, tilting his head slightly, "are you detaining me?" Linda felt Reynolds' stare now, confusion shifting to concern. He didn't know. He hadn't seen what happened. The words burned her throat. "No, sir." Grant exhaled slowly, measured. His gaze flicked toward Reynolds for the first time. "Good to see the department still has some professionals." Then, without another word, he turned, walked back to his car, and drove away. Linda didn't move. She couldn't. Her hands trembled as she stared at the empty street. This wasn't over. She knew it. And so did Grant. Linda didn't sleep that night. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her body stiff, her mind stuck in an endless loop. The slap, the silence, the way Grant had looked at her, no yelling, no threats, just stillness. She had spent her entire career believing she had control, but tonight it felt like she had none. She squeezed her eyes shut, willing herself to forget, to move on. But the moment she closed them, she saw his face again. By morning, her stomach was knotted so tight it hurt. She forced herself out of bed, got dressed, and checked her phone. A single message from the precinct's internal affairs department. Report to the chief's office. Immediately. Her chest tightened. It was happening. The moment she stepped into the station, she felt the stares. Conversations quieted when she walked past. A few officers exchanged looks but said nothing. Nothing had been officially said yet, but Linda knew how this worked. Word always got around. She forced her feet forward, keeping her head high even as her pulse pounded. By the time she reached the chief's office, her hands were clammy. She wiped them on her uniform before gripping the door handle and stepping inside. Grant was sitting behind his desk, flipping through a file, calm, controlled, like always. To his left stood Captain Howard, arms crossed, face unreadable. The air in the room was heavy. Grant didn't look up right away. He let the silence drag before finally meeting her gaze. "Officer Carson," he said evenly. "Sit." Her legs felt stiff as she lowered herself into the chair across from him. Grant leaned back, clasping his hands together. Then after a long pause, he spoke. "Tell me, how would you describe last night's stop?" Linda swallowed. A test. Her throat felt dry. She forced herself to speak. "Routine stop for failure to signal," she said carefully. Grant nodded like he expected that answer. And what happened next? Her pulse pounded in her ears. I asked for his ID. The driver was uncooperative. Grant lifted a brow. "Uncooperative," he repeated, his tone sharp but quiet. Linda hesitated. It sounded weak. He questioned why he was being stopped. There was a beat of silence. Then Grant turned to Captain Howard. "Would you say questioning an officer is considered uncooperative?" Howard barely blinked. "Not unless the driver refuses to comply." Grant's eyes slid back to Linda. "Did I refuse to comply?" Her jaw clenched. "No, sir." Grant exhaled through his nose. Slow, measured. And then came the question she had been dreading. "Why did you hit me, Officer Carson?" The words landed like a brick in her stomach. She wanted to explain, to justify, but she had nothing. "Did you feel threatened?" "No, sir." "Did I resist?" "No, sir." "Did I insult you?" "No, sir." Grant studied her. His face was unreadable, but there was something cold beneath his calm. "Then tell me, Carson." He leaned forward slightly. "What exactly made you strike me?" The room felt too small. Her throat locked up. For the first time, she couldn't lie to herself. Her lips parted, but her voice barely came out. "I lost my temper." Grant didn't react. No anger, no satisfaction, just silence. Then he reached into his desk drawer, pulled out a single piece of paper, and slid it across the desk. Linda's stomach twisted as she glanced down. Suspension notice. "You're off duty until further notice," Grant said simply. Linda's hands trembled as she picked it up. "Chief Grant, He was already standing. "Dismissed." She barely remembered standing up, barely remembered walking out of the office. All she knew was that as she stepped into the hallway, the weight of that single moment pressed down on her chest like a stone. This wasn't over. Not even close. The days passed in silence. No calls, no emails, nothing. Linda sat in her apartment staring at the suspension notice on her kitchen table. Indefinite leave. It was a waiting game now. Waiting for internal affairs, waiting for the final decision on her career, waiting to figure out what the hell she was supposed to do now. She had told herself she wasn't that kind of cop, that she wasn't reckless, that she wasn't driven by bias. But if that were true, then why couldn't she stop replaying that moment? the slap, the way Grant had looked at her afterward, not with anger, not with fear, just knowing. Her phone buzzed, cutting through the silence. She almost ignored it until she saw the name on the screen, Nathaniel Grant. Her chest tightened as she answered. Carson. His voice was steady. She swallowed. Sir? A pause. Meet me at Riverside Park, 10 minutes. The call ended before she could say anything else. She stared at her phone. He hadn't reported her to Internal Affairs himself. He could have. He should have. So why was he calling her now? She grabbed her jacket and left. Riverside Park was nearly empty when she arrived. A few joggers, a couple sitting on a bench, a man walking his dog. And then she saw him. Nathaniel Grant stood near the water's edge, hands in his pockets, staring at the slow-moving river. Linda hesitated. She could leave. She could turn around, pretend she never got the call, wait for Internal Affairs to make their decision. But something about the way he stood there, calm, unreadable, kept her feet moving. She stopped a few feet away. You called me. Grant nodded, still looking at the water. Then, without turning, he asked, Have you ever been pulled over before? Linda frowned. What? Grant exhaled slowly, then turned to face her. A routine stop. Have you ever had a cop flash their lights at you? Ask for your license? Question where you were going? Linda hesitated. She thought about it. Maybe once or twice. Grant nodded once. I've lost count. The words hit harder than she expected. Linda shifted her weight. Sir, But Grant wasn't done. Every city I've lived in, he continued, every neighborhood I've called home, it happens over and over. A cop sees me and wonders, why is he here? Does he belong? Linda looked away. She had nothing to say. Grant studied her for a long moment. Then finally he told her the truth she had been avoiding. You hit me because I didn't act afraid of you. Her breath caught. You expected me to be nervous, he said, his voice even, to scramble for my wallet, to act like I was guilty of something. Linda's fingers curled into fists. And when I stayed calm, that made you angry. She wanted to argue, to explain, but she had nothing, because he was right. She felt her throat tighten, but no words came out. Grant let out a slow breath. I didn't call you here to lecture you, Carson. She finally met his eyes. Then why did you? Grant studied her for a long moment before speaking. Because now you have a choice. Linda frowned. What choice? You can walk away from this and tell yourself it was just a mistake. His voice was calm, but there was something heavy beneath it. Or you can sit with it, really sit with it, and ask yourself why it happened. The wind rolled off the water, cool against Linda's skin. She looked away. Grant turned, his posture relaxed, but his words were sharp. When Internal Affairs calls you back in, they're going to ask if you've learned anything. Her breath caught. You expected me to be nervous, he said, his voice even, to scramble for my wallet, to act like I was guilty of something. Linda's fingers curled into fists. And when I stayed calm, that made you angry. She wanted to argue, to explain, but she had nothing, because he was right. She felt her throat tighten, but no words came out. Grant let out a slow breath. I didn't call you here to lecture you, Carson. She finally met his eyes. Then why did you? Grant studied her for a long moment before speaking. Because now you have a choice. Linda frowned. What choice? You can walk away from this and tell yourself it was just a mistake. His voice was calm, but there was something heavy beneath it. Or you can sit with it, really sit with it, and ask yourself why it happened. The wind rolled off the water, cool against Linda's skin. She looked away. Grant turned, his posture relaxed, but his words were sharp. When Internal Affairs calls you back in, they're going to ask if you've learned anything. The driver didn't fight, didn't resist. but it didn't stop the officer from shoving him harder. Linda didn't look away, because she had seen this story before. She had lived it. The screen went black. A suffocating silence filled the room. Detective Pierce crossed her arms. "Let's talk about assumptions." No one spoke. She let the silence sit. Then her sharp eyes landed on Linda. "Officer Carson," she said, "what did that officer see when he pulled that man over?" Linda's throat went dry. She already knew the answer. Her voice came out quieter than she expected. "A threat." Pierce nodded. "And what did you see when you pulled over Chief Grant?" Linda felt a lump form in her throat. She wanted to deny it, wanted to justify it, but there was no escaping the truth anymore. A threat. A flicker of something crossed Pierce's face. Approval? Maybe. But she wasn't done. She took a slow step forward, lowering her voice. "And was he?" Linda exhaled. Her answer was barely above a whisper. "No." The weight of it hit her all at once. She had spent her entire career telling herself she wasn't biased, that she treated everyone the same, that she followed the law without judgment. But that night, she had reacted to something deeper than the law. Pierce held her gaze. "Then tell me, Carson, where did that idea come from?" Linda didn't have an answer. She wanted to blame her training, the pressure of the job, the things she had seen over the years, but deep down she knew this wasn't about the job. It was about her. The room was silent. Pierce finally exhaled and nodded. "Good." Then she turned to the rest of the class. "Bias isn't always about hate. Sometimes it's just about expectation, about what we assume before we even know the facts." She glanced at Linda again. "And when you have power, that assumption can turn into something deadly." Linda sat back in her chair, feeling like the air had been knocked out of her. For the first time since that night, she wasn't running from the truth. She was facing it. That's how long it had been since Linda last walked into the precinct. 60 days of silence, of training, of sitting with the truth. Now as she stepped through the familiar glass doors, everything felt different. The station buzzed with the usual noise. Phones ringing, keyboards clacking, voices murmuring over reports. But when they saw her, the shift was subtle. Conversations dipped. Glances were exchanged. A few officers turned, watching as she walked past. No one said anything, but Linda could feel it. They knew. She wasn't sure if it was judgment or curiosity. Maybe both. She forced herself to keep moving, her boots clicking against the tile floor. She had earned this second chance. Now she had to prove she deserved it. She reached her desk and set her bag down, taking a slow breath. Then a shadow passed by. Nathaniel Grant. He walked past her, heading toward his office like he always did. Linda braced herself. Would he ignore her? Would he pretend she wasn't there? She wouldn't blame him. But then he stopped, right at his office door. His hand rested on the handle for a second. Then he turned slightly. Their eyes met. Grant's expression didn't change, but his voice was clear, even. "Welcome back." Linda's breath caught. It wasn't warm, it wasn't cold, just a statement. But somehow it meant everything. She gave a small nod. "Thank you, sir." Grant held her gaze for a moment longer. Then he turned, stepped inside, and shut the door behind him. Linda sat down at her desk, exhaling slowly. She had been given a second chance. What she did with it? That was up to her now. Prejudice isn't always loud. It doesn't always come with slurs or raised voices. Sometimes it's quiet, a thought, a feeling, a split-second assumption. It hides in the way we see people, in the way we expect them to act. It can live in the hands of those with power, not always in hatred, but in hesitation. The question isn't whether bias exists. It does. The real question is, what will you do about it? Will you ignore it? Pretend it isn't there, or will you sit with it? Face it? Change? Change isn't comfortable. It doesn't happen overnight. But it starts with a choice to question your own perspective, a choice to listen instead of defend, a choice to see not what you assume, but what's real. If this story made you think, share it, because these are the conversations that matter, and change begins with you.